Welcome to the Deep Dive. We grab a stack of sources, articles, research, and our own notes and distill them into the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, all just for you. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an era that really shaped modern America, the late 19th century. Picture this. It's 1893, Chicago World's Fair. President Cleveland hits a button.
Right, just one button.
And bam, thousands of electric lights just blaze to life. Machines start humming. The whole place is buzzing. It must have felt like magic.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mentioned the Salt Lake City Herald saying the electric age had arrived, talking about the magic of electricity. People were genuinely, blown away, full of optimism.
But here's the crux of our deep dive today, our mission, if you will. This time, say, 1870 to 1900, it's full of contradictions, isn't it?
Definitely. On one side, you have this explosion of invention, massive economic growth, this new consumer world starting to take shape.
But on the other side, deep social problems, really harsh labor battles, economic crashes. So we're going to explore that paradox, industrialization and the rise of big business. How did all this progress also create huge challenges, especially for working people?
We've got a great range of sources to draw on: patent records, stories of the big industrialists, but also firsthand accounts of factory life, the beginnings of advertising. It paints a really rich, sometimes conflicting picture.
Okay, let's dive in. Part one, the spark of invention and a changing landscape. You called it an invention fever earlier. Just how intense was it? Give us the numbers again.
The numbers are, pretty wild. The U.S. Patent Office, way back in its first decade, like 1790s, only 276 inventions recorded.
Okay, tiny.
Yeah. But between 1860 and 1890, almost 450,000 patents. And then another 235,000 just in the 1890s. It shows this incredible drive for, efficiency, comfort, just more stuff.
And it wasn't just huge industrial things, right? These inventions started changing daily life, too.
Absolutely. You had steam and electricity boosting big industry, sure, giving us vastly increased power. But think about the office typewriters in 1867, cash register 79, adding machines 85. Huge for business.
Right, making things faster, more organized.
And at home, the vacuum cleaner starts showing up. The flush toilet, which was a huge deal for public health, cutting down disease tin cans for food.
Tin cans, yeah. Seems small now, but big then.
Huge. And later, Clarence Birdseye experimenting with frozen foods. Some sources even suggest these home inventions, by saving time on chores, sort of laid the groundwork for the modern women's movement. Gave some women more time for other things.
Interesting angle, though it probably also raised expectations about how clean houses should be.
That's the other side of it, yeah. But if we had to pick the single most important industrial advance,
What would it be?
steel. It was just so much stronger and more durable than iron, perfect for rails, bridges, eventually skyscrapers.
And the new processes, Bessemer and open hearth, they made it much easier to produce.
Massively easier and cheaper. Think about this. 1860, maybe 13,000 tons of steel produced in the U.S. By 1879, over 1 million tons.
Wow.
And by 1900, 10 million tons.
That's incredible growth. And the price dropped significantly, too.
Yeah, over 80%. So steel became, as the sources say, the cornerstone of the American economy. It fed construction, railroads, everything. Laid the foundation for the car industry later on.
So steel is building the country physically. What about connecting it? Communications were changing fast, too.
Oh, yeah. The first transatlantic telegraph cable in 1858 was revolutionary. Messages across the ocean in hours, not weeks. And Western Union built this massive telegraph network, like 200,000 miles of wire.
And then Bell patents the telephone in 1876.
Right. And Edison actually improved on it. By 1900, AT&T had connected over 1 million phones. It really started breaking down that rural isolation that had always defined America. Hard to imagine now.
It really is. That shrinking of distance must have felt profound.
It was. And speaking of shrinking distances and new tech, that brings us to a really fascinating rivalry. Edison versus Westinghouse, the battle over electricity.
Ah, yes, the War of the Currents. Edison, the famous inventor, light bulb, phonograph, all that.
Right, prolific guy, 1,093 patents. His Menlo Park lab was like an invention factory. But then George Westinghouse came along in 1886 with alternating current, or AC.
And the big difference was?
AC could travel much further than Edison's direct current, DC. DC was limited to maybe a couple of miles from the power source. AC could go for miles and miles, power whole cities, reach factories and farms way out.
Which Edison did not like.
Not one bit. He launched this intense PR campaign, trying to paint AC as dangerous. He even infamously promoted using AC for the first electric chair executions, just to associate it with death in the public mind.
Wow. That's pretty ruthless. Really shows the high stakes and the cutthroat nature of business back then.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about inventing. It was about dominating the market.
Okay, so these inventions are happening, power grids are being built. Who's actually building the giant companies around them? Let's talk part two. Titans of industry and their empires. These are the famous names, right? But controversial ones, robber barons or captains of industry.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The term robber baron suggests they got rich by, exploiting people and breaking rules. Captains of industry highlights their genius, their drive, how they built things. The truth is probably somewhere in between and varied from person to person.
Let's look at railroads first. Huge growth there, 35,000 miles of track in 1865 to over 200,000 by 1900. They connected everything, raw materials to factories, goods to markets, but the guys running them were different.
Very different approaches sometimes. You take Jay Gould, he's often seen as the classic robber baron. He'd buy up railroads, maybe slap on a coat of paint, but do minimal real improvements, and then squeeze farmers and businesses with high shipping rates. Made a fortune, over $100 million, but people hated him.
Okay, pure profit motive there.
Pretty much. Then you have someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt, also amassed a huge fortune, also over $100 million, and could be absolutely ruthless in business. But he also seemed to genuinely care about building a good railroad. He consolidated smaller, inefficient lines into the New York Central Railroad, making it a powerful, functional system.
So still focused on wealth, but also on building something lasting and efficient. It's not black and white.
Exactly. Now, Andrew Carnegie and steel. That's the classic rags to riches tale, right? Immigrant kid, starts at the bottom, works his way up, invests smart, ends up dominating the steel industry. His company was making, $40 million a year profit by 1900.
Incredible. And he was known for being smart about business, buying competitors cheap during downturns, always upgrading machinery.
Very shrewd. But then there's his other side, the gospel of wealth. This idea he promoted that the rich had a moral obligation to use their wealth for the public good.
Right, funding libraries, hospitals, universities. He famously said the wealthy man should be like a trustee for his poorer brethren, using his wisdom to administer the wealth for their benefit.
It's a fascinating philosophy. Of course, it was also tied up with ideas like social Darwinism, this survival of the fittest applied to society, suggesting maybe the wealthy were inherently more capable.
Which also fueled that whole self-made man myth boosted by writers like Horatio Alger.
Luck and pluck, as Alger put it. Now, compare Carnegie to John D. Rockefeller in oil. Another humble beginning, but his path to dominance was famously methodical and some would say brutal.
Standard Oil. How did he gain so much control?
He perfected two main strategies. First, horizontal integration, just buying up or merging with competitors.
Yeah.
By 1879, Standard Oil controlled something like 95% of U.S. oil refining. Just staggering control.
95%.
Yeah. Then vertical integration, controlling everything from start to finish. Owning the oil wells, the pipelines, the barrel factories, the delivery systems, total control.
And he used trusts and holding companies to get around laws.
Clever legal maneuvers, yeah.
Yeah.
He consolidated immense power. And the reaction was divided, wasn't it?
Totally. Competitors and critics were furious. The New York World called Standard Oil a pitiless and grasping monopoly, but he also made kerosene much cheaper, right? Like 80% cheaper.
He did. So again, that paradox. Ruthless tactics, crushing competition, but also delivering efficiency and lower prices for consumers. It's complicated.
And finally, in this group, J.P. Morgan, different background.
Yeah, Morgan was born rich. He wasn't the inventor or the industrialist himself. He was the financier, the investment banker. He funded guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller.
And he gained power how? By demanding seats on the boards of companies he financed.
Exactly. That gave him huge influence, leading to accusations that his firm was a money trust controlling too much capital. His biggest move was probably buying out Carnegie Steel in 1901 for nearly $500 million.
To create U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar company.
The very first. Think about the scale one estimate said Morgan's firm controlled assets worth more than all the land west of the Mississippi. It shows this incredible concentration of financial power.
Okay, so we have these immense fortunes being built, massive industries rising, but what was the cost? Let's shift to part 3, the human cost. Labor struggles. Because for the average worker, life wasn't necessarily getting easier, was it?
No. Often quite the opposite. While some living standards did improve overall, for many factory workers, conditions were, as the sources say, deplorable. And remember, the country was shifting. Most people used to farm, but by 1900, the majority were moving to cities for factory work.
And what did that work look like?
Grim. The average wage was maybe 20 cents an hour, around $600 a year. That left maybe 20% of city dwellers below the poverty line. Workweeks were incredibly long. 60 hours was common in steel mills, often 12 hours a day, 7 days a week.
12 hours, 7 days, and dangerous, too.
Extremely dangerous. Safety was an afterthought. In 1913, something like 25,000 Americans died on the job. Another 700,000 were injured. Shocking numbers.
And the work itself. Repetitive, dehumanizing. You mentioned scientific management.
Yeah, Frederick Taylor's ideas, sometimes called stopwatch management, breaking every job down into tiny, timed, repetitive motions to maximize efficiency. It treated workers like, well, cogs in a well-oiled machine, not individuals.
And this kind of work made it easier to bring in cheaper labor, like women and children.
Exactly. If the task is simple and repetitive, you don't need skilled craftsmen. So the number of women working outside the home tripled, mostly in textiles or as clerks. But they were paid far less than men, often justified by the awful pretense they didn't need a full living wage.
And child labor was increasing too?
Sadly, yes. Kids working long hours, even dangerous night shifts in places like glass factories, for just a fraction of an adult man's pay. This really started to worry early reformers.
So faced with these conditions, low pay, danger, workers must have been frustrated. How did they try to fight back initially?
Well, early efforts were often met with pretty overwhelming force. Owners used strikebreakers, made workers sign yellow dog contracts, promising not to join a union. Early protests sometimes turned violent, like the Molly Maguires and the Pennsylvania coal fields in the 1870s.
They used intimidation and violence.
They did against mine bosses, mainly, but they were ruthlessly suppressed. 24 convicted, 10 hanged in one day, the day of the rope. It sent a brutal message. Disorganized violence would just lead to more violence from the authorities and owners.
Okay, so violence wasn't the answer. What about organized unions?
There were attempts. The National Labor Union tried in the 1860s but fizzled out. More significant was the Knights of Labor, the KOL. They grew after the Panic of 1873 and had this big idea, one big union. They welcomed almost everyone, skilled, unskilled, men, women, black workers, immigrants. They wanted broad solidarity, and they had some success, winning strikes, growing to over 700,000 members by 1886.
But then came Haymarket.
Yeah, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, 1886, a rally for the 8-hour day. Someone threw a bomb at the police, killing one officer. Chaos erupted.
And the unions got blamed.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Especially the Knights of Labor and anarchist groups. Even though the KOL wasn't directly involved in the bombing, the press went wild headlines about rioting and bloodshed. Public opinion turned sharply against organized labor. Several organizers were convicted and hanged, seen as martyrs by labor activists. But the damage was done. KOL membership just plummeted.
So Haymarket was a huge setback. What emerged after that?
The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, formed that same year, 1886. Led by Samuel Gompers, it took a different approach. It was mostly made up of craft unions, skilled workers like carpenters, plumbers, etc.
And their focus was different too.
Much more pragmatic, less about broad social change, more focused on economic gains for its members, better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. They largely avoided politics. It grew steadily, reaching 1 million members by 1914, but still only represented a small fraction, maybe 15%, of non-farm workers because it excluded the unskilled majority.
And even with the AFL, the big strikes of the 1890s were brutally crushed, right? Homestead and Pullman.
Absolutely crushing blows.
Yeah.
Homestead in 92 at Carnegie Steel. The manager, Henry Frick, hated unions. He locked workers out, brought in Pinkerton guards. A literal gun battle broke out. People died. The state militia came in, protected strikebreakers, and the union was broken. An assassination attempt on Frick didn't help public perception either.
And Pullman, 2 years later.
Pullman strike, 1894. Sparked by wage cuts during a depression while rents in George Pullman's company town stayed high. Eugene V. Debs led the American Railway Union in a nationwide boycott, refusing to handle trains with Pullman cars.
How did the government react?
President Cleveland sent in federal troops. The excuse was that the strike was interfering with U.S. mail delivery, since mail cars were attached to trains. Debs was arrested, the strike collapsed. No gains for labor, just more damage to their reputation. It really underlines what one labor organizer, George Estes, said about the era. Capital and labor basically saw each other as enemies. Any gain for one side felt like a loss for the other. Deep, deep conflict.
An intense period of struggle. But alongside all this industrial conflict, something else was emerging. Part 4. The dawn of consumer culture. How did shopping itself start to change?
It really modernized. Instead of just small general stores, big cities got these huge department stores, Macy's, Gimbel's, Marshall Field's. Think grand buildings, amazing displays.
And for people outside the city?
Chain stores started popping up, like A&P for groceries, Woolworths for variety goods. And architectural changes mattered. Two big plate glass windows for window shopping became a thing. L. Frank Baum, the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz, was actually involved in promoting better window display.
No kidding, the Wizard of Oz guy. Okay. And what about people in really rural areas? How did they access these new goods?
Mail order catalogs. This was huge. Aaron Montgomery Ward started in 1872, and then Sears, Roebuck and Company came along in 1886. By the late 1890s, Sears was sending out hundreds of thousands of catalogs each year.
The consumer's Bible, as the sources call it.
For farmers, it was amazing. They could bypass local stores that often charged high prices or force them into debt. Suddenly, they could order almost anything: farm tools, clothes, bicycles, eventually even cars, and have it delivered. It brought luxuries nationwide.
And all this selling needed advertising, right?
Oh, yeah. Advertising spending exploded close to $100 million a year by 1900, constantly pushing new and improved models. Professional ad agencies started up. Newspapers filled with full-page ads. Creating desire became big business.
And a crucial piece of this puzzle was credit, wasn't it? Making it possible for people to buy things even if they didn't have the cash up front.
Absolutely critical. Department stores started offering store accounts. Companies like Singer Sewing Machines pioneered installment plans. $1 down, $1 a week was their famous slogan. It made expensive items seem affordable.
So this connects back to the paradox, doesn't it? Even people struggling with low wages could maybe buy things that seemed like symbols of middle-class life.
Precisely. Roland Marchand, an advertising historian, called it the parable on the democracy of goods. The idea was that access to products, the ability to buy things, became almost more important than having access to the means of production, like owning a factory or farm. It let the aspiring middle class, and even some working class folks, feel like they were participating, achieving a certain status through consumption.
Even if it meant going into debt.
Right. That was the risk. But it offered this illusion, or maybe sometimes the reality, of upward mobility through buying things, even while economic inequality was massive and labor struggles were intense.
So bringing it all together, this deep dive really highlights how industrialization and the rise of big business just fundamentally remade America. Amazing inventions, huge wealth creation, but also terrible working conditions, fierce conflicts, and the very beginnings of our modern consumer society. Progress and pain, hand in hand.
It definitely leaves you thinking. And maybe a final thought for you, our listeners. What is the real cost of that kind of rapid progress? Do we still see those same tensions today between innovation and worker well-being, between capital and labor?
And what about the power of consumer culture that was born back then? How much does that still shape our lives, our desires, our economy? How do we find that balance between pushing forward technologically and economically while also caring for social equity and just, human well-being?
Questions that certainly echo from that era right into our own.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this journey back to the late 19th century has given you plenty to chew on. We'll see you next time.